I had been living in my beautiful colonial home for 37 years, watching the oak trees I planted as saplings grow tall enough to shade the entire front yard. Every morning, I would sit on the wraparound porch with my coffee, watching the neighborhood come alive as people headed off to work and children walked to school. The house had 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a spacious kitchen that opened to a family room with a stone fireplace, and a dining room where we had hosted countless family gatherings over the decades. My late wife Margaret and I had saved every penny to buy this place back in 1987. We had fallen in love with the crown molding, the hardwood floors, and the way the afternoon sun streamed through the bay windows in the living room. Margaret always said this house had good bones, and she was right. We had raised our son David here, watched him take his first steps in the hallway, helped him with homework at the kitchen table, and celebrated his high school graduation in the backyard under the string lights we had hung between the maple trees. After Margaret passed 3 years ago, David had been wonderfully supportive. He would call every few days, stop by on weekends, and make sure I was managing okay on my own. When he married Jennifer 2 years later, I was genuinely happy for him. She seemed nice enough during their courtship, though I noticed she was particular about things. She had opinions about everything from the wedding flowers to the restaurant where we celebrated their engagement. Where in the world are you listening to this story right now? What time is it where you are? I find myself wondering about all the people who might be hearing these words, whether you are starting your day with morning coffee like I used to, or perhaps listening during an evening walk. There is something comforting about knowing that stories like this connect us across time zones and continents, reminding us that family challenges are universal human experiences. About 6 months after their wedding, David mentioned that he and Jennifer were looking for a house. The apartment they were renting was too small, and they wanted to start a family soon. I suggested they take their time finding the right place, maybe look in some of the newer developments where young families were settling. Jennifer had very specific requirements. She wanted a colonial-style home with character, a large kitchen for entertaining, and a yard where children could play safely. One evening in late spring, they came over for dinner. I had made pot roast, Margaret's recipe, and we were sitting around the dining room table when Jennifer looked around and sighed wistfully. She said this house was exactly what she had been dreaming about. The layout was perfect, the neighborhood was ideal for raising children, and the mature landscaping gave it such charm. David agreed, saying he had always loved growing up here and hoped to find something similar. As we finished dessert, Jennifer started talking about their house hunting frustrations. Every colonial they had looked at was either too expensive, needed too much work, or lacked the character of older homes. She kept coming back to how perfect my house was, how it had everything they were looking for. David mentioned that houses in our neighborhood rarely came on the market, and when they did, they sold quickly for premium prices. Over the following weeks, Jennifer began making comments about the house whenever they visited. She would run her hand along the banister and talk about how solid it felt. She would stand in the kitchen and mention how much she loved the granite countertops and the way the island provided so much workspace. She started pointing out little improvements that could be made, like updating the light fixtures or refinishing the hardwood floors. At first, I found her enthusiasm charming. It was nice to hear someone appreciate the home that Margaret and I had loved so much. But gradually, her comments began to feel different. She started talking about the house as if it were already hers, discussing future plans for redecorating and renovating. She would say things like when we move in here or after we take over the master bedroom. David seemed oblivious to how his wife was talking about my home. When I tried to bring it up gently, suggesting that they focus on finding their own place, he would just laugh and say Jennifer was a dreamer, always planning ahead. He said it was harmless to let her imagine living in a beautiful house while they searched for something they could actually afford. But Jennifer's behavior was becoming more concerning. She started measuring rooms and taking pictures of different areas. She would open closets and cabinets, examining the storage space as if conducting an inventory. During one visit, I found her in the master bedroom, opening drawers in Margaret's antique dresser and looking through the walk-in closet. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was just admiring the craftsmanship and imagining how she would organize things. The breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon in June. I was working in the garden, tending to Margaret's rose bushes, when I heard Jennifer and David talking on the porch. Jennifer was saying it was time to start making practical plans. She said I was getting older and would probably be happier in a smaller place that was easier to maintain. David suggested they wait and see what happened naturally, but Jennifer was insistent that they needed to be proactive about securing their future. I realized with growing alarm that Jennifer was not just dreaming about living in my house. She was planning for it, expecting it, and treating it as if it were already promised to them. The way she talked about me needing to downsize, about them taking over the property, made it clear that she saw my continued residence here as temporary. She had somehow convinced herself that this house would inevitably become theirs, and she was simply waiting for the right moment to make it happen. Jennifer's behavior escalated quickly after that Sunday afternoon conversation. She started arriving at my house earlier and staying later during their visits, making herself completely at home in ways that made me increasingly uncomfortable. She would go straight to the kitchen and start rearranging things, claiming she was just trying to be helpful by organizing the spice rack or cleaning out the refrigerator. When I politely asked her to leave things as they were, she would smile and say she was just practicing for when she would be taking care of the house properly. The most disturbing incident happened on a Tuesday evening when I returned from my weekly grocery shopping. I had been gone for about an hour and a half, visiting the market and stopping by the pharmacy to pick up my medications. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed David's car was there, though I had not been expecting them. I walked through the front door with my grocery bags and found Jennifer in the living room, measuring the windows with a tape measure. She looked up at me with a bright smile and explained that she wanted to get accurate measurements for new curtains. She said the current drapes were outdated and did not let in enough natural light. David was sitting in my recliner, looking at his phone, seemingly unbothered by his wife's behavior. When I asked why they had let themselves in without calling first, Jennifer laughed and said they were family now, and family did not need to stand on ceremony. I wonder how many of you have experienced something similar with your own family members, that uncomfortable feeling when boundaries start shifting without your permission. It is a strange thing when people you love begin treating your personal space as if it belongs to them, making decisions about your home and your life as if you are no longer the primary resident. Jennifer had brought fabric samples and was holding them up against the windows, talking about how much brighter the room would look with lighter colors. She had also brought a folder full of magazine clippings showing different decorating ideas for colonial-style homes. She spread them out on the coffee table and started pointing out features she wanted to incorporate, like built-in bookshelves and a more modern color scheme for the walls. David finally looked up from his phone and told Jennifer they should probably head home, but she was not ready to leave yet. She wanted to show me her ideas for the master bedroom, talking about how the space had so much potential if it were updated properly. She had already decided that the current furniture arrangement was not optimal and had sketched out a new layout that would make better use of the room. As the weeks passed, Jennifer began treating my house like her personal project. She would arrive with paint samples, fabric swatches, and catalogs from home improvement stores. She had detailed plans for every room, from converting the guest bedroom into a nursery to turning the basement into a family recreation area. She talked about these changes as inevitabilities, not possibilities, using phrases like when we renovate and after we move in. The situation reached a new level of discomfort when Jennifer started inviting her friends over to see the house. She would give them tours, pointing out all the features she loved and explaining her renovation plans. She introduced me to her friends as David's father, but she talked about the house as if it were already hers. She would say things like, "We are so lucky to have found this place and we cannot wait to start making it our own." One afternoon, I overheard Jennifer on the phone with someone, presumably her mother, describing the house in detail. She was explaining how perfect it was for raising children, how the neighborhood was ideal, and how they had been so fortunate to find exactly what they were looking for. She mentioned that there were a few obstacles to work through, but she was confident everything would work out in their favor soon. The breaking point came when Jennifer started discussing timeline specifics with David. She wanted to know when they could start the renovations, when they could move their furniture in, and when I would be transitioning to a smaller living situation. David seemed uncomfortable with the conversation, suggesting they should take things one step at a time, but Jennifer was insistent that they needed to make concrete plans. She had already researched senior living communities in the area and had printed out brochures for places she thought would be suitable for me. She presented them as if she were doing me a favor, explaining how these communities offered services and activities that would be perfect for someone my age. She emphasized how much easier life would be without the responsibility of maintaining a large house and yard. I realized that Jennifer had constructed an entire fantasy about our living situation, and she was becoming increasingly impatient to make it a reality. She had convinced herself that the house would naturally become theirs, and she was simply waiting for me to accept the inevitable transition. The way she talked about it, she made it sound like a logical progression that everyone should embrace willingly. Jennifer's sense of entitlement reached alarming new heights when she started making actual changes to my house without asking permission. I first noticed it when I came home from my Thursday morning doctor's appointment and found that she had rearranged all the furniture in the living room. The sofa was moved to a different wall, the coffee table was repositioned, and she had taken down several of Margaret's family photos that had hung in the same spots for decades. When I asked her what she was doing, Jennifer explained that she was just experimenting with better traffic flow patterns. She said the room had never been arranged to take advantage of the natural light, and she wanted to create a more open, modern feel. She had brought her own throw pillows and a new area rug that she claimed would tie the room together better than Margaret's old Persian carpet, which she had rolled up and stored in the basement. David was at work during most of these incidents, so he was unaware of how invasive his wife's behavior had become. When I tried to discuss it with him, he would dismiss my concerns as minor household adjustments that Jennifer was making to help out. He seemed to think I should appreciate having someone who cared enough to improve the house, and he suggested that maybe some updates were long overdue anyway. The following week, Jennifer arrived with a team of cleaning ladies that she had hired to deep clean the house. She had scheduled them without consulting me, explaining that she wanted to give the place a thorough going over before they started any serious renovations. The cleaning crew spent the entire day washing walls, scrubbing floors, and organizing closets according to Jennifer's specifications. While they worked, Jennifer went through my personal belongings with disturbing thoroughness. She sorted through Margaret's jewelry box, claiming she was just organizing it properly, but I noticed she had set aside several pieces that she said would need professional cleaning. She went through my desk drawers and filing cabinets, explaining that she was helping me get important documents organized for easier access. Most upsetting was when she started packing away Margaret's belongings from the master bedroom. She had brought several boxes and was carefully wrapping Margaret's perfume bottles, decorative items, and personal mementos. When I asked what she was doing, Jennifer said she thought it might be healthier for me to put some of these things in storage, at least temporarily, while the house was being updated. She had also brought new bedding and curtains for the master bedroom, explaining that she wanted to create a fresh, updated look that would be more conducive to moving forward. She talked about the importance of not living in the past and suggested that holding on to too many reminders of Margaret might be preventing me from embracing positive changes in my life. Jennifer had developed a systematic approach to taking over my house. She would arrive early in the morning when I was still having breakfast and stay until late in the evening, treating the place like her personal renovation project. She had keys made without asking, explaining that it was more convenient for her to let herself in when she needed to take measurements or coordinate with contractors. The contractors were another source of constant disruption. Jennifer had been getting estimates for various home improvement projects, from updating the kitchen appliances to refinishing the hardwood floors. She scheduled these appointments during times when I was usually out of the house, but occasionally I would return to find strangers examining my electrical system or measuring rooms for potential renovations. When I confronted Jennifer about these unauthorized visits, she acted surprised that I was upset. She said she was just being proactive about getting the house ready for improvements that would benefit everyone. She emphasized how much time and effort she was putting into these preparations and seemed genuinely confused about why I was not more grateful for her help. The situation became even more troubling when Jennifer started discussing the house with real estate agents. She claimed she was just getting a professional assessment of the property's value and potential, but I overheard her asking detailed questions about market conditions and comparable sales in the neighborhood. She was particularly interested in understanding how much the house might be worth after certain renovations were completed. Jennifer had also been researching the legal aspects of property transfers and inheritance planning. She had printed out articles about estate planning and had highlighted sections about transferring real estate to family members. She left these materials on the kitchen counter where I would be sure to see them, along with business cards for estate planning attorneys and financial advisors who specialized in senior transitions. The most disturbing development was when Jennifer started talking about timeline pressures. She mentioned that their lease on the apartment was coming up for renewal, and she did not want to commit to another year if they were going to be moving soon. She had been in contact with moving companies to get estimates for relocating their belongings, and she had started shopping for furniture that would work better in the larger space. Jennifer's behavior had evolved from innocent admiration to active possession. She was treating my house as if the transfer of ownership was already decided, and she was simply managing the practical details of making it happen. The way she talked about it, she made it sound like I was being unreasonable for not embracing what she saw as a natural and beneficial transition for everyone involved. The truth about Jennifer's intentions hit me like a sledgehammer on a humid Tuesday evening in July. I had gone upstairs to retrieve a book from my bedroom and was walking back down the hallway when I heard voices coming from the kitchen. David and Jennifer were having what they thought was a private conversation, their voices low but intense enough that I could make out most of what they were saying from the top of the stairs. Jennifer was telling David that they could not wait much longer for me to come around to their way of thinking. She said I was being stubborn about the transition, and they needed to take a more direct approach to secure their future. David's voice was hesitant as he suggested that maybe they should give me more time to adjust to the idea, but Jennifer was having none of it. She said time was exactly what they did not have. Their apartment lease was expiring in 2 months, and she was not going to renew it just because I was being difficult about accepting reality. She had already put deposits down on several renovation projects, and the contractors were expecting to start work in September. Jennifer emphasized that everything had been planned around the assumption that we would be living in the house together temporarily before I moved to a more suitable living situation. What shocked me most was hearing Jennifer refer to the house as theirs repeatedly throughout the conversation. She talked about our house and our property as if legal ownership had already been transferred. She mentioned that she had been patient enough with my adjustment period, but it was time for me to understand that the house represented their future and their children's inheritance. David tried to interject that they had never actually discussed any formal arrangements with me, but Jennifer cut him off impatiently. She said some things were understood within families, and adult children naturally inherited their parents' homes when the time was right. She argued that I was rattling around in a house that was too big for one person while they were cramped in a tiny apartment, planning for children they wanted to raise in a proper family home. The conversation took an even more disturbing turn when Jennifer started talking about my competency to manage such a large property. She said I was clearly overwhelmed by the maintenance responsibilities and would be much happier in a senior community where professionals could handle those concerns. She mentioned that she had already spoken with a social worker about the best approaches for helping elderly parents transition to more appropriate living situations. Jennifer had apparently been documenting what she saw as evidence of my declining ability to maintain the house properly. She pointed out that I had not updated the kitchen appliances in years, that some of the exterior paint was beginning to peel, and that the landscaping was not as meticulously maintained as it had been when Margaret was alive. She presented these normal signs of aging in any home as proof that I was no longer capable of proper home ownership. David seemed uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but Jennifer pressed on with increasing urgency. She said they had already made financial commitments based on the assumption that they would be living in the house soon. She had purchased furniture, scheduled renovations, and even put down a deposit on a landscaping company to redo the backyard. She could not afford to lose those deposits because I was being unreasonable about accepting help. The most chilling part of their conversation came when Jennifer started talking about legal options. She said she had been researching elder care laws and had learned about situations where adult children could petition for guardianship if their parents were no longer competent to make sound decisions about their living situations. She suggested that if I continued to be stubborn about accepting their help, they might need to explore more formal interventions. Jennifer mentioned that she had already documented several incidents that could be presented as evidence of my declining mental state. She claimed that my resistance to their reasonable suggestions about home improvement showed that I was not thinking clearly about my own best interests. She said my insistence on maintaining such a large house at my age demonstrated poor judgment that could be harmful to my health and safety. David finally spoke up, saying that involving lawyers seemed extreme, but Jennifer was adamant that they needed to protect their investment in the relationship. She had spent months planning their future in the house, and she was not going to let my stubbornness derail everything they had worked toward. She said sometimes adult children had to make difficult decisions for their parents' own good, even when those parents initially resisted. The conversation ended with Jennifer giving David an ultimatum. She said he needed to have a serious talk with me within the next week about making the transition official. If I continued to resist their reasonable requests for cooperation, she would start exploring legal options to ensure that everyone's best interests were protected. She emphasized that they were thinking about my welfare as much as their own future. As their voices faded and I heard them moving toward the front door, I stood frozen on the staircase, trying to process what I had just learned. Jennifer had been operating under the assumption that my house would naturally become theirs, and she had made extensive plans based on that belief. More terrifying, she was prepared to use legal means to force the transition if I did not cooperate voluntarily. I realized that Jennifer had never actually asked about inheriting the house or discussed any formal arrangements. She had simply assumed that as David's wife, she had rights to the property, and she was treating my continued residence as a temporary obstacle to overcome. The depth of her presumption and the calculated nature of her planning left me feeling utterly betrayed by someone I had welcomed into my family. The morning after the security incident, I called my longtime attorney Robert Castelliano, who had handled Margaret's estate and had been our family lawyer for over 20 years. His secretary squeezed me in for an emergency appointment that afternoon, and when I arrived at his downtown office, I was still shaking from the humiliation of being treated like a trespasser in my own home. Robert listened carefully as I explained the entire situation, from Jennifer's initial presumptions about the house to the previous night's security confrontation. His face grew more serious with each detail I shared, and when I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and shook his head in disbelief. He said in 30 years of practicing law, he had seen family disputes over property, but rarely had he encountered someone who had made such extensive plans based on assumptions about inheritance rights that simply did not exist. He pulled out a thick file folder that contained all the documents related to my property ownership. The deed was clear and unambiguous. I was the sole owner of the house and had been since Margaret and I purchased it in 1987. When Margaret passed away, her portion of the property had transferred to me automatically through our joint ownership arrangement. There were no liens, no outstanding mortgages, and no legal obligations that would give David or Jennifer any claim to the property. Robert explained that Jennifer's assumptions about natural inheritance were completely unfounded. Adult children do not automatically inherit their parents' homes, and there was no legal basis for her belief that she had any current rights to the property. He said her threats about guardianship proceedings were particularly troubling, as they suggested she was willing to make false claims about my mental competency to achieve her goals. The security incident was especially concerning from a legal perspective. Robert said that having me removed from my own property could potentially constitute several different crimes, including false imprisonment and harassment. He recommended that we document everything carefully and consider filing a police report if Jennifer continued to interfere with my access to my own home. However, Robert also offered some perspective that helped me understand how to approach the situation strategically. He said that many family disputes could be resolved more effectively through demonstration rather than confrontation. Instead of immediately pursuing legal action against Jennifer, he suggested we focus on establishing clear boundaries and making sure she understood the actual legal reality of the property ownership. I wonder how many of you listening have ever had to stand up for yourselves when others assumed they knew what was best for your life. There is something particularly challenging about family conflicts because the people involved are supposed to care about your well-being, yet sometimes their vision of what is best for you does not align with your own wishes or rights. Robert recommended that I also speak with my neighbor Helen Morrison, who had been living next door for 15 years and had witnessed much of Jennifer's recent behavior. Helen had always been a good friend to Margaret and me, and she had expressed concern about how Jennifer was treating my property as if it belonged to her. Robert thought Helen's observations could be valuable if we needed to document the pattern of inappropriate behavior. When I visited Helen that evening, she was eager to share what she had observed. She said Jennifer's behavior had been increasingly strange and controlling, and she had been wondering if I was aware of how much Jennifer was interfering with my daily life. Helen had seen the contractors coming and going, the furniture being rearranged, and Jennifer bringing friends over for house tours as if she were the homeowner. Helen also mentioned that Jennifer had approached her several weeks earlier, asking questions about the neighborhood and how long various residents had lived in their homes. Jennifer had specifically asked about property values and whether Helen knew anything about my plans for the future. Helen said she had found the conversation odd because Jennifer talked about the house as if she would be living there permanently. Most importantly, Helen offered to serve as a witness to any future incidents and to help document Jennifer's behavior if needed. She said she had already started keeping notes about the unusual activity at my house because she was concerned about my well-being. Helen also mentioned that several other neighbors had noticed Jennifer's presumptuous behavior and would likely support me if the situation escalated. Robert had also given me contact information for a geriatric care manager named Patricia Williams, who specialized in helping elderly individuals navigate family conflicts related to living arrangements. Patricia had experience dealing with situations where adult children tried to pressure their parents into housing decisions that were not in the parents' best interests. When I met with Patricia the following day, she explained that what I was experiencing was unfortunately common. Adult children sometimes convinced themselves that they were acting in their parents' best interests when they were actually prioritizing their own convenience or financial gain. She said Jennifer's behavior showed classic signs of someone who had decided what outcome she wanted and was working backward to justify it. Patricia helped me develop strategies for setting clear boundaries with Jennifer while maintaining my relationship with David. She emphasized that I had every right to control access to my own home and to make decisions about my living situation without interference from family members who disagreed with my choices. The conversation with Patricia was particularly helpful because she validated my feelings about the situation. She said my desire to remain in my own home was completely reasonable and that Jennifer's pressure tactics were inappropriate regardless of her stated motivations. Patricia also provided me with resources about elder rights and legal protections against family coercion. By the end of that week, I had assembled a support team that included my attorney, my neighbor, and a professional advocate who understood the dynamics of family conflicts involving elderly parents. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt like I had allies who understood the situation and were prepared to help me protect my rights and my dignity. Armed with knowledge about my legal rights and a team of supportive allies, I began developing a strategic plan to address Jennifer's presumptions and reclaim control of my own home. Robert had advised me to document everything carefully and to approach the situation methodically rather than emotionally. The goal was not revenge, but establishing clear boundaries and ensuring that Jennifer understood the reality of property ownership. The first step was changing the locks on my house. I had given David and Jennifer keys when they got married, trusting that they would use them appropriately for genuine emergencies or planned visits. However, Jennifer's unauthorized entry and her coordination of contractor visits made it clear that she was treating my home as if it belonged to her. Robert recommended a locksmith who could install high-quality deadbolts and provide me with detailed documentation of the lock change for legal purposes. While the locksmith worked, I also arranged to have a security system installed. The system included cameras at the front and back entrances, motion sensors, and a monitoring service that would alert me to any unauthorized attempts to enter the property. Helen had offered to serve as an emergency contact for the security company, and she was enthusiastic about helping me protect my home from further intrusions. Patricia had helped me prepare a formal letter to David and Jennifer, explaining that I would no longer tolerate unauthorized access to my property or interference with my personal belongings. The letter was carefully worded to avoid accusatory language while making it clear that their assumptions about future living arrangements were incorrect. Robert reviewed the letter to ensure it established proper legal notice of my expectations going forward. The letter explained that while I valued my relationship with both of them, I needed them to respect my autonomy and my property rights. It specified that future visits should be scheduled in advance and that any discussions about my living situation or home improvements needed to include my explicit consent. The letter also made it clear that I had no intention of transferring ownership of my house or moving to a different living situation at this time. I also began gathering documentation that would demonstrate my mental competency and my ability to manage my own affairs. Patricia had recommended that I undergo a comprehensive medical evaluation with my longtime physician, Dr. Harrison, who could provide professional documentation of my cognitive abilities and physical health. Dr. Harrison had known me for over 15 years and was familiar with my medical history and capabilities. The medical evaluation went smoothly, with Dr. Harrison noting that I was in excellent health for my age and showed no signs of cognitive decline or impairment. He provided me with a detailed written assessment that specifically addressed my mental acuity, decision-making abilities, and capacity to manage my own affairs independently. Robert said this documentation would be valuable if Jennifer attempted to pursue any legal challenges to my competency. I also organized all of my financial records to demonstrate that I was managing my money responsibly and had the resources to maintain my home properly. This included bank statements, investment accounts, insurance policies, and records of recent home maintenance and improvements. The documentation showed that I was financially stable and fully capable of making sound decisions about my property and living situation. Helen had been keeping detailed notes about Jennifer's activities around my house, including dates, times, and descriptions of her behavior. She had photographed some of the unauthorized changes Jennifer had made and had documented the various contractors and service providers who had been coming and going without my permission. This evidence would be crucial if we needed to demonstrate the pattern of Jennifer's presumptuous behavior. Where you are listening to this story, whether it is early morning or late at night, I hope you can appreciate the importance of having people in your corner when facing difficult family situations. There is tremendous strength in community support, and knowing that others believe in your right to make your own decisions can provide the courage needed to stand up for yourself when family members try to override your autonomy. Robert had also recommended that I consult with a financial planner who specialized in estate planning for elderly clients. The planner helped me review my will and other legal documents to ensure that my wishes were clearly stated and legally sound. This process also gave me the opportunity to consider whether I wanted to make any changes to my estate plans in light of recent events with Jennifer's behavior. The estate planning consultation revealed that my current will left the house to David, but it also included provisions that would protect my right to live in the property for as long as I chose. The financial planner suggested adding additional language that would prevent any beneficiaries from pressuring me to vacate the property prematurely or from making claims on the house while I was still alive and competent. I also decided to establish a revocable trust that would give me even more control over the property during my lifetime while still providing for David's inheritance after my death. The trust structure would make it clear that I retained complete authority over the property and that no one else had any current rights or claims to it. Robert said this approach would eliminate any ambiguity about ownership and prevent future misunderstandings. As part of my preparation, I also reached out to other family members and friends to ensure they understood the situation. I called my brother Tom, who lived across the country, and explained what had been happening with Jennifer's presumptions about the house. Tom was shocked to learn about Jennifer's behavior and offered his full support if I needed character witnesses or additional documentation of my competency. By the end of 2 weeks, I had assembled a comprehensive response to Jennifer's unauthorized takeover attempts. I had legal documentation, medical evaluation, financial records, witness statements, and security measures in place. Most importantly, I had a clear plan for confronting Jennifer and David about the reality of property ownership and my expectations for respectful treatment going forward. The implementation of my plan began on a crisp Saturday morning in early August. I had decided to start with a direct conversation with David, hoping that speaking to him privately might help him understand the seriousness of the situation without Jennifer's immediate influence. I called him and asked if he could stop by the house alone that morning, explaining that I needed to discuss something important with him as my son. David arrived around 10 o'clock, and I could tell immediately that he was nervous about the conversation. He had probably sensed the tension building over the past few weeks, even if he had not fully grasped the extent of Jennifer's presumptuous behavior. I invited him to sit in the living room, noting that Jennifer had rearranged the furniture again during her last unauthorized visit, despite my previous requests for her to stop making changes. I began by telling David how much I loved him and how important our relationship was to me. I explained that what I needed to discuss was not about my feelings for him personally, but about boundaries and respect that were essential for maintaining our family bond. I could see him relaxing slightly, probably relieved that I was not launching into immediate criticism of his wife. Then I laid out the facts systematically. I showed him the formal letter that Robert had helped me prepare, explaining that Jennifer's behavior had crossed several important lines regarding my property and personal autonomy. David read the letter carefully, and I watched his expression change from confusion to concern as he began to understand the scope of what had been happening. I explained that Jennifer had been operating under assumptions about property ownership that were simply incorrect. I showed him copies of the deed and other legal documents that Robert had prepared, making it clear that I was the sole owner of the house and that no one else had any current legal rights to the property. David seemed genuinely surprised to learn that Jennifer had been making plans based on the belief that the house would automatically become theirs. The conversation became more difficult when I described some of Jennifer's more concerning behaviors, including her threats about guardianship proceedings and her documentation of supposed evidence of my declining competency. David was clearly uncomfortable learning about these aspects of his wife's planning, and he kept insisting that Jennifer surely meant well even if her approach was misguided. I showed David the medical evaluation from Dr. Harrison and the financial documentation that demonstrated my competency and stability. I explained that I had taken these steps not because I doubted my own abilities, but because Jennifer's threats had made it necessary to have professional documentation of my mental and financial capacity. David seemed shocked to realize that the situation had escalated to the point where I felt the need to protect myself legally. When I told David about the new locks and security system, he looked genuinely distressed. He said he had no idea that Jennifer's behavior had made me feel unsafe in my own home, and he apologized for not recognizing how serious the situation had become. He asked if there was a way to resolve things without involving lawyers and security measures, expressing hope that the family could work through the misunderstandings privately. I appreciated David's concern, but I explained that the situation had moved beyond simple misunderstandings. Jennifer had made extensive plans based on incorrect assumptions, had threatened legal action against me, and had demonstrated a pattern of disrespecting my boundaries and property rights. I emphasized that while I wanted to maintain our family relationships, I could not allow anyone to treat my home as if it belonged to them. David asked what he could do to help repair the situation, and I could hear the genuine remorse in his voice. I told him that the first step was for him to understand that Jennifer's assumptions about inheritance were completely wrong and that her behavior toward me and my property needed to stop immediately. I explained that future visits would need to be scheduled in advance and that no one would have unauthorized access to my house anymore. I also made it clear that any discussions about my future living arrangements would need to include my explicit participation and consent. I said I was perfectly capable of making my own decisions about where and how I wanted to live, and I would not tolerate anyone making plans for my life without my involvement. David nodded, saying he understood and would make sure Jennifer received the same message. The conversation took a more emotional turn when David asked if I thought Jennifer was a bad person or if I no longer wanted her to be part of the family. I explained that my concerns were about behavior, not character, and that I hoped Jennifer could learn to respect appropriate boundaries once she understood the actual legal situation. I emphasized that I wanted both of them to be happy, but not at the expense of my own autonomy and dignity. As our conversation concluded, David promised to have a serious discussion with Jennifer about everything we had covered. He said he would make sure she understood that her assumptions about the house were incorrect and that her approach to helping me transition to a different living situation was not welcome. He also assured me that he would support my right to make my own decisions about my home and my life. I could see that David was struggling with the realization that his wife had been behaving inappropriately toward his father. He seemed torn between loyalty to Jennifer and recognition that my concerns were legitimate and serious. I felt hopeful that he would be able to help Jennifer understand the reality of the situation and adjust her behavior accordingly. However, I was also prepared for the possibility that Jennifer might not accept the information gracefully. Robert had warned me that people who had made extensive plans based on incorrect assumptions sometimes doubled down on their position rather than admitting their mistakes. I knew that David's conversation with Jennifer might be just the beginning of a more challenging process of establishing proper boundaries. David's conversation with Jennifer did not go as smoothly as either of us had hoped. 3 days after our talk, David called to tell me that Jennifer was furious about what she called my sudden unreasonable behavior and legal threats. She had accused him of not standing up for their marriage and their future, and she was insisting that I was clearly experiencing some kind of mental decline that was making me paranoid and hostile toward family members who were trying to help. Jennifer had refused to accept the legal documentation about property ownership, claiming that David must have misunderstood something because it was obvious that the house would naturally pass to them as the next generation. She argued that my hiring of lawyers and installation of security systems proved that I was not thinking clearly and that these were exactly the kinds of poor decisions that demonstrated my need for family intervention. Most concerning was Jennifer's reaction to learning about the changed locks. She had apparently driven to the house that evening to test whether her key still worked, and when she discovered that it did not, she had become enraged. David said she spent the entire night researching elder abuse laws and guardianship procedures, convinced that someone was manipulating me into making decisions that were harmful to the family's interests. Jennifer had also contacted several of the contractors she had been working with, trying to salvage her renovation plans by insisting that the work would proceed as scheduled. When the contractors explained that they could not work on a property without the owner's permission, Jennifer had argued with them about who the real decision-maker was regarding the house. Some of the contractors had called me directly to clarify the situation, which gave me additional documentation of Jennifer's presumptuous behavior. The situation escalated further when Jennifer decided to visit my house unannounced to confront me directly about what she saw as my unreasonable hostility toward her efforts to help. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon while I was working in the garden and immediately launched into an aggressive lecture about family loyalty and gratitude. She said I was being selfish and short-sighted by refusing to accept assistance from people who cared about my welfare. Jennifer accused me of being manipulated by lawyers who were probably trying to extract fees from an elderly client who did not understand his own best interests. She said it was obvious that I needed help managing such a large property, and she could not understand why I was resisting common-sense solutions that would benefit everyone involved. She insisted that her plans for the house were motivated entirely by concern for my well-being and the family's future security. When I calmly explained that I was the legal owner of the property and had every right to make decisions about my own home, Jennifer became even more agitated. She said that legal technicalities were less important than practical realities, and the practical reality was that I needed help whether I wanted to admit it or not. She argued that adult children had responsibilities to step in when their parents were making poor decisions, even if those parents initially resisted. Jennifer's visit culminated in her demanding to see the deed and other property documents, insisting that there must be some mistake or misunderstanding about the ownership situation. When I declined to show her my private legal documents, she accused me of hiding something and suggested that my secrecy proved that I was not being honest about the true status of the property. She said she would find out the real facts through her own research if necessary. The confrontation ended when I firmly told Jennifer that she needed to leave my property immediately and that future visits would need to be scheduled in advance with my explicit permission. She responded by saying that she would not be shut out of decisions that affected her family's future, and she warned me that my hostility toward people who were trying to help me would have serious consequences for everyone involved. After Jennifer left, I immediately called Robert to report the incident and to discuss whether her behavior constituted harassment or trespassing. Robert said that Jennifer's refusal to accept my property rights and her aggressive attempts to override my decisions were definitely concerning from a legal perspective. He recommended that I document the encounter carefully and consider filing a restraining order if her behavior continued to escalate. I also called Helen to let her know about Jennifer's visit, and Helen mentioned that she had observed the confrontation from her kitchen window. She said Jennifer's body language and tone of voice had appeared threatening, and she was prepared to provide a witness statement if needed. Helen also mentioned that she had seen Jennifer taking photographs of my house and yard during her visit, which seemed like additional evidence of her ongoing presumptuous behavior. The next development came when Jennifer started contacting other family members to build support for her position. She called my brother Tom, claiming that she was concerned about my mental health and my susceptibility to manipulation by unscrupulous lawyers. She told Tom that I had suddenly become hostile and paranoid, and she asked for his help in convincing me to accept reasonable assistance with managing my affairs. Tom called me immediately after Jennifer's conversation to ask what was really happening. I explained the entire situation, including Jennifer's assumptions about property ownership and her unauthorized activities in my house. Tom was appalled to learn about Jennifer's behavior and assured me that he would not be supporting any of her efforts to interfere with my autonomy. He also offered to speak with other family members if Jennifer continued her campaign to portray me as incompetent. Jennifer's actions were becoming increasingly desperate and inappropriate. She had clearly expected that presenting herself as a concerned family member would generate support for her position, but instead she was discovering that other people found her behavior as troubling as I did. Her refusal to accept the legal reality of property ownership and her escalating attempts to override my decisions were creating a pattern of harassment that could no longer be ignored. By the end of that week, it was clear that Jennifer had no intention of respecting my boundaries or accepting my right to make decisions about my own property. Her behavior was moving beyond presumptuous into potentially illegal territory, and I knew that more decisive action would be necessary to protect my rights and restore peace to my life. The moment of truth arrived on a scorching hot Tuesday afternoon in late August when Jennifer made her most audacious move yet. She had apparently decided that subtle manipulation and family pressure were not working quickly enough, so she escalated to what she must have thought would be her masterstroke. She arrived at my house with a moving truck, 2 movers, and a social worker she had somehow convinced to accompany her for what she described as a welfare check on an elderly man who was being exploited by unscrupulous advisors. I was sitting on my front porch reading the newspaper when the convoy pulled into my driveway. Jennifer stepped out of her car with a triumphant expression, clearly believing that she had finally found the leverage needed to force me out of my own home. She marched up to the porch with the social worker, a young woman named Ms. Rodriguez, who looked uncomfortable about the situation but seemed to believe Jennifer's version of events. Jennifer announced that she had brought professional help to assess my living situation and to assist with my transition to more appropriate housing. She told Ms. Rodriguez that I had been living alone in a house that was too large for me to maintain safely, and that family members had been trying unsuccessfully to help me accept reasonable assistance. She presented herself as a concerned daughter-in-law who was worried about my welfare and my vulnerability to people who might be taking advantage of my age. Ms. Rodriguez began asking me questions about my daily routine, my ability to manage household tasks, and whether I felt safe living independently. I answered her questions calmly and thoroughly, demonstrating my mental clarity and my understanding of my own situation. However, Jennifer kept interrupting to point out what she claimed were signs of my declining capabilities, such as the fact that I had not updated my kitchen appliances recently or that some exterior paint was beginning to fade. When Ms. Rodriguez asked about my family support system, Jennifer immediately launched into a detailed explanation of all the help she had been trying to provide. She described her renovation plans as necessary safety improvements, her furniture rearrangements as assistance with creating better living conditions, and her research into senior communities as responsible planning for my future needs. She made it sound as if I was stubbornly refusing reasonable assistance from caring family members. The social worker seemed somewhat persuaded by Jennifer's presentation until I asked if I could show her some documentation about my situation. I invited Ms. Rodriguez inside and presented her with the medical evaluation from Dr. Harrison, the financial records that demonstrated my stability, and most importantly, the property deed that clearly established my ownership of the house. I also showed her the formal letter from my attorney explaining my legal rights and the inappropriate nature of Jennifer's assumptions. Ms. Rodriguez examined the documents carefully, and I could see her expression changing as she realized that Jennifer had misrepresented the fundamental facts of the situation. When she asked Jennifer directly about the property ownership, Jennifer became flustered and insisted that legal technicalities were less important than practical family arrangements. She argued that the documents were probably outdated or that there must be some kind of trust or inheritance arrangement that gave her family rights to the property. The confrontation reached its climax when I calmly explained to Ms. Rodriguez that Jennifer was not actually my daughter-in-law trying to help me, but rather someone who had been making unauthorized changes to my property based on incorrect assumptions about inheritance. I showed Ms. Rodriguez the photographs that Helen had taken of Jennifer's presumptuous activities, including the unauthorized contractor visits and furniture rearrangements. Those of you listening from around the world, whether it is morning where you are or the middle of the night, I hope you can understand the satisfaction of that moment when truth finally emerged after months of manipulation and presumption. There is something profound about watching someone's elaborate fantasy collapse when confronted with undeniable reality. Jennifer's reaction was explosive. She accused me of lying to the social worker and insisted that there must be some kind of conspiracy to keep her from accessing what was rightfully her family's inheritance. She demanded that Ms. Rodriguez investigate my relationship with my attorney, claiming that elderly people were often manipulated into making legal arrangements that benefited lawyers rather than family members. Ms. Rodriguez had heard enough. She explained to Jennifer that I was clearly competent to make my own decisions about my living situation and that my property ownership was legally established and unambiguous. She said that Jennifer's assumptions about inheritance rights were incorrect and that her unauthorized activities on my property could potentially constitute harassment or trespassing. When Jennifer realized that the social worker was not going to support her position, she became even more desperate. She pointed to the moving truck and insisted that arrangements had already been made for my transition to senior housing. She said deposits had been paid, services had been scheduled, and contractors were expecting to begin renovations within the week. She argued that cancelling these plans would result in significant financial losses that I would be responsible for covering. I looked Jennifer directly in the eye and delivered the words I had been preparing for weeks. I told her that I had never authorized any of her plans, that I had never agreed to move anywhere, and that any financial commitment she had made based on her incorrect assumptions were entirely her own responsibility. I explained that I was the sole owner of my property and that she had no legal standing to make decisions about my home or my life. The revelation hit Jennifer like a physical blow. For the first time since this ordeal began, she seemed to understand that her elaborate fantasy about inheriting my house was exactly that, a fantasy. She had made extensive plans, financial commitments, and social announcements based on assumptions that had no basis in reality. The moving truck, the social worker, the contractors, and the senior housing arrangements were all part of a scheme built on a foundation that had never existed. Ms. Rodriguez recommended that Jennifer leave my property immediately and suggested that she might want to consult with her own attorney about the legal implications of her unauthorized activities. She also provided me with information about how to file complaints if Jennifer's harassment continued, and she documented the entire incident for her official report. As Jennifer stood in my driveway, staring at the moving truck she would have to send away empty, I felt a profound sense of vindication. The truth about property ownership had finally been established beyond any doubt, and Jennifer's months of presumptuous planning had been revealed as the elaborate delusion it had always been. The aftermath of Jennifer's failed moving truck scheme unfolded over the following weeks like dominoes falling in a carefully arranged pattern. Her financial commitments based on false assumptions about property ownership created a cascade of consequences that she had to navigate entirely on her own. The moving company charged her a substantial fee for the wasted trip and equipment rental, and the senior housing facility kept her deposit when she was forced to cancel the arrangement she had made without my knowledge or consent. The contractors Jennifer had hired were equally unsympathetic when she tried to explain why their services were no longer needed. Several of them had already ordered materials and rearranged their schedules based on her assurances that the renovation work was approved by the property owner. When they learned that Jennifer had no authority to authorize work on my house, they demanded compensation for their preparation costs and threatened legal action if she refused to pay. David was mortified when he learned the full extent of his wife's presumptuous behavior. He had been aware of some of Jennifer's planning activities, but he had not realized how far she had gone in making financial commitments based on assumptions about inheritance. He called me repeatedly during those first few days after the moving truck incident, apologizing profusely and asking what he could do to repair the damage to our relationship. I appreciated David's remorse, but I made it clear that the responsibility for fixing the situation lay primarily with Jennifer. She needed to acknowledge the inappropriateness of her behavior, accept the legal reality of property ownership, and demonstrate respect for my autonomy going forward. I told David that while I valued our father-son relationship, I would not tolerate any future interference with my property or my personal decisions. Jennifer's reaction to the collapse of her plans was a mixture of rage, humiliation, and desperate attempts to salvage some dignity from the situation. She initially tried to blame everyone except herself for the misunderstanding, claiming that David had led her to believe the house would naturally become theirs and that my attorney had manipulated me into making poor decisions about family relationships. When these explanations failed to generate sympathy, Jennifer shifted to attacking my character and competency. She told anyone who would listen that I was a selfish old man who cared more about property ownership than family harmony. She suggested that my unwillingness to share my resources with the younger generation showed a lack of generosity and wisdom that was disappointing in someone my age. However, Jennifer's campaign to portray herself as the victim of an unfair situation backfired spectacularly. The other family members she contacted were appalled to learn about her unauthorized activities in my house and her presumptuous planning based on inheritance assumptions. My brother Tom spoke with several relatives, explaining the true situation and ensuring that everyone understood Jennifer's behavior had been inappropriate and legally questionable. The neighbors also rallied around me in ways that were deeply touching. Helen had witnessed much of Jennifer's presumptuous behavior over the months, and she made sure that other people in the neighborhood understood what had really been happening. Several neighbors approached me during my daily walks to express their support and to share their own concerns about Jennifer's activities around my property. Most satisfying was when Jennifer tried to contact Dr. Harrison to gather evidence for her claims about my declining competency. Dr. Harrison not only refused to discuss my medical information with her, but he also informed her that attempting to obtain someone else's private health records without authorization could constitute a violation of privacy laws. He suggested that Jennifer might want to focus on addressing her own behavior rather than trying to find fault with mine. For those of you listening who may be facing similar challenges with family members who think they know what is best for your life, I hope this story gives you courage to stand up for your own rights and dignity. There is tremendous strength in knowing that you have the legal and moral authority to make decisions about your own property and living situation, regardless of what others might prefer. The legal consequences for Jennifer continued to mount as the full scope of her unauthorized activities became clear. Robert recommended that I document all of the financial losses Jennifer had incurred through her presumptuous planning, both as protection against any future claims she might make and as evidence of the extent of her inappropriate behavior. The total amount was substantial, including contractor deposits, moving expenses, facility fees, and various other commitments she had made without any legal authority. Robert also suggested that I consider filing a formal complaint with the police about Jennifer's harassment and trespassing, particularly given her refusal to respect my property rights even after being explicitly told to stop. While I was hesitant to involve criminal authorities in what had begun as a family dispute, Robert emphasized that Jennifer's behavior had crossed legal boundaries that deserved official documentation. The social worker, Ms. Rodriguez, had filed her own report about the incident, noting that Jennifer had misrepresented the facts when requesting the welfare check and had wasted public resources based on false claims about my competency and living situation. Her report would become part of the official record if Jennifer ever attempted similar manipulation tactics in the future. Jennifer's desperation reached new heights when she tried to convince David to pressure me into reconsidering my position about the house. She argued that even if the legal ownership was clear, family loyalty should motivate me to help them achieve their housing goals. She suggested that I could transfer the property to them immediately, or at least allow them to move in as tenants while they saved money for their own home purchase. David, to his credit, refused to participate in any further pressure tactics against me. He told Jennifer that she needed to accept responsibility for her mistakes and stop trying to manipulate family relationships to achieve her personal goals. He made it clear that he supported my right to make my own decisions about my property and that he would not be party to any additional schemes to override my autonomy. The final blow to Jennifer's credibility came when several of the contractors she had worked with began sharing stories about her behavior with other professionals in the area. Word spread quickly through the local business community about a woman who had been making unauthorized renovation plans for a property she did not own, and Jennifer found herself effectively blacklisted by reputable contractors who did not want to risk similar complications. By the end of September, Jennifer had been forced to accept the complete failure of her elaborate plans and the significant financial consequences of her presumptuous behavior. She had learned the hard way that assumptions about inheritance rights have no legal standing and that unauthorized interference with someone else's property can result in serious personal and financial consequences. 6 months have passed since Jennifer's moving truck debacle, and my life has settled into a peaceful routine that feels both familiar and renewed. The house that Jennifer once presumed would become hers remains exactly where it has always been, under my complete ownership and control. I wake each morning in my own bed, in my own room, surrounded by Margaret's belongings that Jennifer had tried to pack away, and I feel a deep satisfaction in having protected not just my property rights, but my dignity and autonomy as well. The legal dust has finally settled completely. Robert helped me file a formal restraining order against Jennifer after she made several more attempts to contact me with what she called reasonable compromise proposals. The restraining order was granted easily, given the documented pattern of harassment and unauthorized interference with my property. Jennifer is now legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of my house or contacting me directly about any matters related to my living situation or property ownership. David and I have slowly rebuilt our relationship, though it required honest conversations about boundaries and respect that were long overdue. He has acknowledged that he failed to recognize the inappropriateness of Jennifer's behavior and that he should have intervened much earlier when she began treating my home as if it belonged to her. We now have dinner together every other Sunday, and he always calls before visiting to ensure that I am available and welcoming of his company. Most importantly, David has made it clear to Jennifer that any future relationship they maintain will depend on her complete acceptance of my autonomy and property rights. He told her that he will not participate in or tolerate any additional schemes to pressure me about my living arrangements, and that she must find a way to respect appropriate boundaries if she wants to remain part of the family. This ultimatum has apparently been a source of ongoing tension in their marriage, but David has remained firm in supporting my position. Jennifer herself has largely disappeared from my life, which has been an enormous relief. I occasionally hear updates through David about her continued financial struggles related to the contractors and commitments she made without authorization. She apparently had to take a second job to pay off the debt she incurred through her presumptuous planning, and the stress has taken a significant toll on her marriage and her social relationships. The neighborhood has returned to its normal quiet rhythm, with Helen continuing to serve as my unofficial security monitor and trusted friend. She still waves from her kitchen window when I work in the garden, and she occasionally stops by for coffee and conversation about local happenings. The other neighbors have also been wonderfully supportive, creating a sense of community protection that makes me feel secure and valued in my own home. Perhaps most satisfying has been the validation I have received from the various professionals who became involved in the situation. Ms. Rodriguez, the social worker, later told me that my case had become a training example for her colleagues about the importance of verifying facts before making assumptions about elder care situations. She said Jennifer's manipulation tactics were unfortunately common, but that my thorough documentation and legal preparation had made it easy to establish the truth quickly. Dr. Harrison has continued to provide excellent medical care and has become an even stronger advocate for my independence and autonomy. He recently completed another comprehensive evaluation of my health and cognitive abilities, not because anyone requested it, but because I wanted updated documentation for my own peace of mind. The results confirmed what I already knew. I remain fully capable of making sound decisions about my life, my health, and my property. The financial planner and estate attorney have also helped me update my legal documents to provide even stronger protections against future interference. My will now include specific language about my right to live in my property for as long as I choose, and my trust arrangement ensures that no one can pressure me to vacate or transfer ownership while I remain competent. These measures may seem excessive, but they provide me with confidence that I will not face similar challenges again. For those of you listening to this story, wherever you are in the world and whatever challenges you may be facing with family members who think they know what is best for your life, I want you to remember that your dignity and autonomy are worth protecting. Age does not diminish your right to make decisions about your own property, your own living situation, and your own future. No one has the authority to override your choices simply because they disagree with them or because they have different ideas about what would be convenient for the family. The experience taught me valuable lessons about the importance of clear communication and firm boundaries within families. I learned that sometimes kindness and patience can be misinterpreted as weakness or agreement, and that allowing small presumptions to continue can lead to much larger problems down the road. If I had addressed Jennifer's initial boundary violations more directly, the situation might never have escalated to the point where legal intervention became necessary. I also learned the tremendous value of having trusted allies and professional support when facing family conflicts. Robert, Helen, Dr. Harrison, and the other people who supported me throughout this ordeal reminded me that I was not alone and that my position was reasonable and legally sound. Their validation gave me the confidence to stand firm when Jennifer tried to make me doubt my own judgment and competency. As I sit on my porch this evening, watching the sun set behind the oak trees that Margaret and I planted decades ago, I feel a deep sense of peace and gratitude. The house that Jennifer tried to claim as her dream home remains exactly what it has always been, my home, where I choose to live, surrounded by memories and possessions that reflect a lifetime of love, work, and careful planning. The roses Margaret planted continue to bloom each summer, the hardwood floors still creak in familiar places, and the morning light still streams through the bay windows just as it did when we first fell in love with this place 37 years ago. Jennifer's elaborate fantasy about owning this house lasted only a few months, but my ownership and love for this property will continue for as long as I draw breath. Most importantly, I wake each morning knowing that I successfully defended not just my property rights, but my fundamental right to live with dignity and respect in my own home, on my own terms, for as long as I choose. The security incident that followed my discovery of Jennifer's true intentions was the most humiliating experience I had endured since Margaret's funeral. 3 days after overhearing that devastating conversation between David and Jennifer, I returned home from my weekly grocery shopping to find a police car in my driveway and 2 uniformed officers standing on my front porch with Jennifer, who was gesturing dramatically and speaking in urgent, concerned tones. As I approached carrying my grocery bags, one of the officers stepped forward and asked if I was the homeowner. When I confirmed that I was, Jennifer immediately interjected that she was my daughter-in-law and that she had called for a welfare check because she was concerned about my mental state and my ability to live safely on my own. She told the officers that I had been exhibiting signs of confusion and paranoia, including changing the locks and making accusations against family members who were trying to help me. The officers looked uncomfortable with the situation, clearly sensing that something was not quite right about Jennifer's story. When they asked me if I was experiencing any problems or if I needed assistance, I explained calmly that I was perfectly fine and that there had been some family misunderstandings about property ownership and living arrangements. I invited them inside to verify that I was competent and that my home was being maintained properly. Jennifer became agitated when the officers accepted my invitation to inspect the house. She followed us through the rooms, pointing out what she claimed were signs of my declining abilities to maintain the property safely. She mentioned that some light bulbs had burned out, that there was dust on surfaces she claimed I could no longer reach, and that the refrigerator contained leftovers that she said proved I was not eating properly. The officers were clearly unimpressed with Jennifer's evidence of my supposed incompetence. They could see that the house was clean, well organized, and properly maintained. When they asked me questions about my daily routine, my medical care, and my financial management, I answered confidently and thoroughly, demonstrating that I was mentally sharp and fully capable of independent living. The situation became more uncomfortable when Jennifer started demanding that the officers force me to undergo a mental competency evaluation. She claimed that elderly people often appeared lucid during brief interactions but showed signs of confusion and poor judgment in their daily decision-making. She insisted that professionals needed to conduct a thorough assessment of my cognitive abilities before allowing me to continue living alone in such a large house. One of the officers asked Jennifer directly about her authority to make decisions regarding my welfare, and she became flustered as she tried to explain her relationship to me and her concerns about my safety. When the officer asked if she lived in the house or had any legal responsibility for my care, Jennifer admitted that she did not, but she argued that family members had moral obligations to intervene when elderly relatives were making poor decisions. The officers then asked me privately if I felt safe in my home and if anyone had been pressuring me to make changes to my living situation against my wishes. I explained that Jennifer had been making assumptions about inheriting my property and had been planning renovations and other changes without my permission. I mentioned that she had been treating my house as if it already belonged to her, despite the fact that I was the sole legal owner. When the officers returned to speak with Jennifer, they explained that I appeared to be competent and capable of making my own decisions about my living arrangements. They told her that unless there was evidence of actual danger or abuse, they could not force me to undergo evaluations or accept assistance that I did not want. They suggested that family disagreements about living arrangements were civil matters that should be resolved through discussion or legal consultation, not police intervention. Jennifer's reaction to this information was explosive. She accused the officers of not taking elder welfare seriously and insisted that they were failing in their duty to protect vulnerable seniors from making dangerous decisions. She claimed that I was clearly being manipulated by someone who was taking advantage of my age and isolation, and she demanded that they investigate who was influencing my recent behavior changes. The officers remained professional but firm in their assessment that I did not require their intervention. They explained to Jennifer that competent adults have the right to make their own decisions about their living situations, even if family members disagree with those choices. They also mentioned that using emergency services for non-emergency family disputes could potentially result in charges for filing false reports. As the officers prepared to leave, Jennifer made one final desperate attempt to convince them that I needed help. She produced printed materials about elder abuse and neglect, claiming that self-neglect was a serious problem among elderly people who refused appropriate assistance. She argued that my resistance to her help was actually a symptom of the very problem she was trying to address. However, her efforts backfired when one of the officers asked her to explain specifically what assistance I was refusing and why she believed she had the authority to provide it. Jennifer's answers revealed the extent of her presumptions about my property and her assumptions about her rights to make decisions about my living situation. The officer noted that her concern seemed to be more about her own plans and expectations than about my actual welfare. After the police left, I sat alone in my living room feeling shaken and violated by the experience. Jennifer had used emergency services to try to force me out of my own home, presenting herself as a concerned family member while actually pursuing her own agenda. The fact that she was willing to involve law enforcement in her scheme to gain control of my property showed how far she was prepared to go to achieve her goals. Those of you listening during difficult times in your own lives, whether it is early morning where you are or late at night, know that there are moments when we must find strength we did not know we possessed. Being treated like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected can shake your confidence in ways that are hard to describe, but it can also clarify exactly what you need to fight for. The police visit also made me realize that Jennifer's behavior had escalated beyond inappropriate presumption into potentially criminal harassment. She was now actively working to undermine my credibility and autonomy using official channels, and she was willing to waste public resources to pursue her personal agenda. This incident convinced me that I needed professional help to protect myself from further manipulation and interference.